Welcome back, chess fans. In today's video, we're looking at a brilliant game played by Bobby Fischer, where he showcases both his exceptional positional understanding and his dynamic play, a perfect example of his all-around mastery of chess. So grab your popcorn and let's go. Today we're going to be looking at a game played by Bobby Fischer. The year is 1957 and the location is New Jersey. This is actually the New Jersey Open Championship in 1957. So I think this game perfectly illustrates how strong Fischer was when it comes to playing positionally, but also being a phenomenal attacker, and overall Bobby Fischer being a very universal player is really illustrated in this game. So let's get started. So Bobby Fischer opens up with e4 as he usually does. E4 best by test. C5 is what is played by his opponent James Sherwin. So we're getting the Sicilian defense. Knight to f3, pawn to e6, and here Fischer chooses to play pawn to d3. Pawn to d3 is not really a popular choice nowadays. People really like to play d4 and go for open Sicilian positions. Here Fischer chooses a more closed approach. So he's basically playing closed Sicilian. So here knight to c6, pawn to g3, and then knight to f6 played by black, bishop to g2, and bishop to e7. Both sides developing here, castles, and knight to d2 played by Fischer. In closed Sicilian, there's a couple of ways white can play. So either white can move the knight away and then play for f4, or white can play in the center with the approach that Fischer took in this game with c3 and d4, and that's what he will do in a couple of moves. So here rook b8 was chosen by Sherwin, and rook b8 might look weird to a lot of beginners here, but it's actually a fairly common move in the closed Sicilian, because in the closed Sicilian, when c3 is played, usually black will go b5, b4 to challenge the pawn chain here, and this is a very common idea. The problem is, in this case, this was not the best move. The best move was to actually strike in the center, which probably would have equalized the game right away and given slightly more chances to James Sherwin. But the problem is that this rook being on b8 actually creates various tactical opportunities in the future, and you're going to see in a couple of moves how this bishop on c1, which will potentially go, not potential, but which will go to f4 and attack this rook on b8, and you will see how this will be problematic for black in a couple of moves. So rook to e1 chosen by Fischer, d6, pawn to c3, b6, so this is just a very normal developing moves, d4, queen to c7, and then e5 chosen by Fischer. And here Sherwin makes his first mistake. He plays knight to d5. Now, the reason why this is a mistake is because Fischer can play c4, knight to b4, and then capture on this d6 square, and then play this move knight to e4. This will allow him to capture on d6, and as I mentioned earlier, bishop will go to f4, and there will be big problems on this diagonal. That is why it was best for Sherwin to take on e5 first and then go knight to d5, because now the pawn is on e5, and even if the same sequence happens, there's no bishop f4. So there is nothing here. The diagonal is closed off, and there are no problems for the black pieces. Okay, black is a little bit cramped, but it should be fine for the most part, because nothing is being lost. At least this knight is a little bit uncomfortable here, but it can go to bare minimum it can go to a6. It probably won't even have to, because the rook's coming to d8 and then knight d3 in this line, but bare minimum it can go to a6 and be completely fine. So this is not what happened in the game, though. Instead, Fischer chose to take on d6 right away. Slight mistake, but still not necessarily a bad move. And then knight to e4. Pawn to c4 here chosen by black. Game review calls this a mistake, but it's very iffy. Calling this a mistake, I think, is a bit of an exaggeration. Perhaps this move is closer to an inaccuracy than a mistake. Bishop a6 was the best move, controlling this diagonal and mainly controlling the c4 square, stopping this c4 pawn push, at least for a move. I think this was the reason why computer likes bishop a6 move the best. So here, instead of that, of course, c4 was played. Knight takes d6, queen takes d6 and knight to g5. So now Fischer wants to put pressure on this h7 pawn. If h6 is played, he would have remaneuvered the knight to c4 and created some problems there. But okay, h6 wasn't played here by Sherwin. Sherwin chose knight to e7 instead. Queen to c2, teaming up with the knight to attack this h7 pawn. Knight g6 blocks the diagonal here. And then h4 played by Fischer. Knight to f6, defending h7. And here Fischer plays a brilliant, breathtaking move. Knight takes h7. Now, what does this move do? First of all, if this is captured by the king, the knight is pinned on g6. So now we see the problem of this rook b8 move earlier, because bishop goes to f4, skewers the queen, attacks the rook behind the queen, and then this rook is simply lost. Now, if knight captures, this is actually what happened in the game, so I will continue from here. Knight captures on h7, and then h5 is played, removing the knight from the control of the f4 square. And here, if the knight simply goes back, bishop f4, and the rook is lost. Here Sherwin set a very interesting sort of a trap. It doesn't really work, but it's still, worth a try. He played knight to h4, which is quite clever. And the idea is that after bishop to f4, the rook cannot be taken on b8, not right away at least, because knight takes g2 is simply devastating. And if king takes g2, there's a bishop to b7 check. The king has to move, and the bishop is picked up. And in this position, which is not even the best move apparently, but it's still good enough. There's probably like queen d5 here, but bare minimum, this bishop can be picked up, and black has two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. And the thing is, the files are closed, or at least semi-closed. This rook has a semi-open e-file, so the rooks don't really have a lot of activity for white, which means that this position is just completely winning for the black pieces, because the minor pieces of black are just much better than this rook on a1. Now here, that's not what happened. Of course, Fischer didn't fall for that. He instead took the knight on h4, rook to b7 played by Sherwin, h6 first, queen takes h4, and what Fischer does here is he takes on g7, that's a tempo on the rook, king takes g7, and here now Fischer smells blood, and instead of just simply moving the bishop back and then sort of playing positionally, he just goes all in. He plays rook to e4, which is semi-x-raying this queen here, so bishop e5 would win the queen. Bishop e5 check is a discovery on the queen. Queen to h5 is played, rook to e3, pawn to f5, and here Fischer plays rook to h3, queen back to e8, and then bishop to e5 check. And here, as you can see, this king is being hunted down and probably going to be checkmated within the next couple of moves, or at least a lot of material is going to be won. So knight to f6 played by Sherwin, queen to d2, king to f7, and then queen to g5 played by Fischer, queen to e7 defending the knight. The knight is simply captured with the bishop, queen takes f6, and then rook h7 here. And the problem is, after queen takes f6 here, if Sherwin takes back the queen, he will simply lose the rook, and then he will be down a whole rook in this endgame. And of course, being down a whole rook is completely lost. He chose to capture on h7, but this is still completely lost because of a very simple bishop to c6 check. And here is when Sherwin resigned, because if bishop to d7 is played, then queen takes e6, and then there's just nothing to be done here. If the rook blocks, this can be taken. If the king moves away, this can still be taken, and then rook to e1. White is up a queen, white has more active pieces, and there's simply nothing black can do. So I think this game perfectly illustrates how strong of a positional player Fischer was, but how quickly he could also switch to an attacking gear and just simply eviscerate his opponents. So I think that's where we should end the video today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!